So thank you all so much for inviting me. This is one of my favorite events because, oh my gosh, every single topic under the actual sun are covered in this conference. So it doesn't matter if you're into development, deployment, thinking about your existence, you've got stuff for everything. So I am going to share a set of slides, and we're going to talk about a topic that is extremely important to all of us, which is making money. Like, yeah, that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about making money. Can everyone see a black slide that says Teams for All on it?
Yes, that's come through perfectly.
Perfect. Okay, you'll see I have subtitles on. The reason for that is there are many folks who might be deaf, might be hard of hearing, might have ADHD, or might not understand my accent. So I always turn on subtitles. There's a setting in Teams. If you go to Teams slideshow, all the way on the right, there's a little checkbox that says slideshow, subtitles, you can turn that on. I recommend you do that. Okay, so how many of you would like to know how to make double your income next year? Raise your hand. What, none of you? Oh, that's so sad, because I was gonna tell you my latest formula, okay, on how you can delight 8 billion humans, AKA make a lot more money, because turns out when people are happy with you, happy with your offering, they tend to spend money, tell their friends, tell their mom, tell everyone they know, and you make more money. So I'll start with a story. About a decade ago, actually almost a decade to the day, I used to work on HoloLens V1. So HoloLens is the mixed reality thing you wear on your head. The entire team had pretty bad insomnia because we were having extremely realistic dreams from aliens and this and that from all of our holographic adventures. When we had insomnia, we would talk to the International Space Station. And on the International Space Station was astronaut Scott Kelly. He also was testing out a HoloLens, using it to do various repairs on the space station. So late at night, he would send us images of the universe. He would send us images of Earth as seen from space. And our team would look at these lights all across the planet. And I think that was the first time I really fully grokked how big this world is. You see the lights across huge swatches of this planet representing humans, right? Humans who were alive at that moment, humans who were awake at that moment, and humans who were, very importantly, using technology and using electricity. So I realized there's 8 billion of us running around this planet. Big, beautiful planet we live in. We're complicated creatures. We're a little annoying sometimes, but we're complicated creatures. Out of those 8 billion people, Microsoft, the company I work at, have for 17 years, serves about 1 billion of them. It's actually over a billion because Windows 10, I think, is 1.3 billion users right now. Office is almost up there with a billion. You know, you look at Azure, Teams, any sort of combination thereof. And I think a lot about, we serve these billion plus customers almost by accident. Many times it's because you wander into a workplace and there's a whole Microsoft setup, or you wander into, you know, your school or university and there's a whole Microsoft setup. But what if we got very, very tactical about how we much more purposely and intentionally served and sought to delight the rest of the planet? So 8 billion people, we got 1 billion under control, cool. We have to keep retaining them and delighting them. But what about everybody else? There's quite a few people. And many of you will say, yes, Donna, many of them don't have electricity. I know this, I know. But there's also a big range of people who do have connectivity and do have power. But I feel like we've sort of left them behind through a variety of reasons and means. So a question I've been asking myself recently, over the past 6 months, I've been doing this experiment. And today's actually the very first time I'm debuting this experiment to other people, because like, oh, Teams Nation, 4,000 people registered, a bunch of my closest friends. Why not debut a new thing that I've never talked to anyone about? I don't think I've even talked to my team about this. So dear my team, if you're watching, sorry, I'll tell you at our team meeting this week. The question I'm asking myself is this: how would X humans find or use my product? X meaning a bunch of variables that we're going to fill in, okay? So let's go through some of these variables. Of course, I now lead accessibility tech for Microsoft, so people with disabilities are top of mind for me. And many of you have heard me talk about the disability spectrum, but I'd like to go through it one more time because you often have to hear it, 7 times for something to stick. Okay, so there's visual disabilities. People who are colorblind, which if there's 12 men on this call, 12 of you dudes, one of you is colorblind. 1 in 12 men are colorblind. That is the thing. I actually think it's more because most people have never done like the colorblind test. They think they're seeing the colors as they are in the world, but they're not. So I actually think it's way more. There's people who have low vision. So any of you wearing glasses right now, including myself, I'm wearing contacts, low vision. We have a disability. And any of you who might be blind. Let's talk about hearing. People who are deaf, such as my boss, Jenny Leigh Fleury, who's our Chief Accessibility Officer, is deaf. She attends meetings with a sign interpreter. And then there's a very large group of people in this world who are hard of hearing. Hard of hearing meaning low hearing. Now, just like colorblindness, I actually don't think we fully understand how many people are hard of hearing. With glasses, there's the societal, let's call it acceptance. Lots of people wear glasses. We test, kids with eye exams when they're like, 5 years old, and we get eye exams quite often. So it's not weird to see us going around with glasses or contacts or, getting LASIK treatments or all of these things. We don't do that with hearing as a planet. And I find that very, very interesting. So, for example, if there's hearing test centers on every corner in drugstores and supermarkets, more of us would be getting hearing tests. If wearing hearing aids became just a commonly societally accepted things, I believe at least maybe 30% more of us would probably be wearing hearing aids. I asked this question on Twitter last week, and I got back a variety of answers. Some was the societal acceptance. The other is, it's just really expensive. Like a set of glasses you can buy for, I don't know, somewhere between $25 US to $250 US. Depends on where you buy it from. Hearing aids, getting fitted, diagnosed, all of these, it starts in the hundreds and goes to the thousands. It's prohibitively expensive and it's not societally accepted. So many people don't know that they have this. It's my hearing soapbox. Third one, I'm going to skip for now and go on to speech. So speech, this is people who may not speak at all, and they speak either through technology or they speak through a third party, such as an interpreter. Or it might be someone who has a speech impediment. Many times we think of this as someone who may have what we call a stutter. They may have the speech impediment when they're nervous or just in general. Then there's mobility. I've been thinking about mobility a lot lately because someone has joined my team who is extraordinary. Christina Malin is now the new director of inclusive design for Microsoft. She's on my team. She's a neurodivergent woman. She has ADHD, but she also has dual arm paralysis. So she cannot use her arms at all. Watching her work is amazing because she uses a foot mouse. So you'll see her in meetings. She'll have a slide up and suddenly things will appear on the slide and her arms are not moving. She's using a foot mouse. She uses dictation to dictate much of her emails. And she also uses a keyboard to type with her feet. Like so cool. So there's mobility like that. There's mobility in people who might be in a wheelchair. There's mobility of people who might be in a completely paralyzed. And then there's sort of limited mobility stuff like many of you. Many of you fractured your elbows and knees and things like that because you've gone skiing enthusiastically. Good job. I don't ski, but I have arthritis. So there's a certain mobility concerns I have. Many of us will age into this. So the two I'd like to spend some time on that we don't spend nearly enough time on are cognitive, which is neurodiversity, and neural, which is mental health. So I actually predict most people in the tech industry have either personally encountered cognitive or neural disability. How many of you have ADHD? Whether you're diagnosed or you think you probably have it. Many of you, you don't have to raise your hands, but that's many of you. Many of you come to me and tell me this. Many of you are dyslexic. Many of you are on the autism spectrum. This is much more common, but because it's an invisible disability, we just don't see it. It's like being hard of hearing. You don't see it. It's not societally talked about. And the more you veer outside US and Western Europe, the less it's talked about. And then there's mental health. This is a topic, right? It's the topic of our times. I would say mental health is probably the topic that comes up most in every conversation between myself and my team. It's something every company's thinking about, every organization. And as you build out your program, product, process, whatever, think about mental health. It can be depression, bipolar, anxiety, whatever it is, but think through it before you just assume, I'm sure no one with a mental health concern is using my thing. Okay. So people with disabilities, you know this matters to me. I will move on to my next topic. Have you considered how people with different power and connectivity situations are using your offering? Okay, this isn't just, oh, I'm somewhere random in Latin America in the Amazon jungle. No, this is people you know. So on the left is a tweet from Homalemo Mohapi, who used to work on my team before. He's at Microsoft, he's in South Africa, and they've been having load shedding, aka power outages, since I've known him. When I was in South Africa, we had power outages. When I was in Nigeria, we had power outages. When I was in Mexico City, we had power outages. When I was in Detroit, Michigan, where I grew up, we had power outages. It is a thing that happens. And we need to factor that not everybody lives in amazing internet connectivity with always on power. Many of us who build products in the US, we forget that because we're born into this privilege and we live in this privilege. I have a funny story for you. Jeff Teeper, if you hear about this, sorry, but it's true. When Teams, the app we're all using, first came out, it didn't work when you weren't connected. And what I mean by it didn't work is it wouldn't even open. So say I was on an airplane, I was going to my destination, and I needed to just open Teams to see, the results of the chat or any meeting details. I couldn't even open the app. It would just close. I filed so much, let's say, specific feedback about this. Like, how are you leaving out more than half of the planet? And people say, what do designers on the team had this conversation to my face and said, why would people use Teams if you don't have connectivity? I said, Outlook has worked without connectivity since the beginning of time. How are we going backwards right now? So think about it, like Outlook has always had offline mode. You connect, mail send, mail receive, but you can draft up all of them. How are we going backwards in Teams? So just keep that in mind as you're building your offering. People have very different power and connectivity standards, and I'll walk you through a few detailed ones in a minute. Third one, this is a topic right now. Do you support a specific country, language, or culture? And if you do support, how do you support? Okay. On the left is a picture of me talking to a few young ladies in Jakarta when I was there for Ignite Tour years ago, back when we had Ignite Tour. We were talking about culture of computer science and what areas of computer science women studied and which areas they didn't. So for me to make an offering, pushing women toward a specific area of computer science that wouldn't land in Jakarta would be, is that a good use of my time or a bad use of my time? Is it opening their eyes to what is possible, or is it just kind of ignoring a cultural standard? These are all choices. Culture, language, currency, culture, language, culture, country, language, culture, are probably one of those ethical questions. Someone just asked me on Twitter today, what do you do about supporting, say, Russia is a good example? It's up to you. If you run your own business, you need to take that stand, and you kind of have to know. You don't have to know right away, but you have to know, and you kind of have to take a stand on it and be ready for the arrows to fly either way. People are going to be mad at you. That is expected. So, for example, Microsoft recently has suspended new sales in Russia. We have an office there. We have an office in Ukraine. We have colleagues in both of these countries. So we had to take a stand, and we have done a bunch of work recently to help our colleagues who are in Ukraine leave. I was just in Prague, and there's some very intense stuff going on there, where many of the colleagues who work out of the Prague office are of Ukrainian background. So there's always these things going on in the world. The Ukraine-Russia situation is just the most recent, but this has come up with Iran in the past. It's come up with China. It's come up with North Korea. What do you, as an organization or as a business owner or someone who works in a business, what are you doing about this? And you don't always have to go and tell everyone. You just have to know. Like, consider the questions. Sit and think through it. What do you stand for? And how are you going to set up your technology to reflect those beliefs? So next one, race and gender. This one's really interesting because it's kind of scientific and kind of not scientific. So I'll tell you what I mean by that. When I was working on Team HoloLens, the V1 of the device, the prototype, I put it on and it fell just through my head. I'm like, why? So I do the screw thing over here. I, adjust it here, adjust it there, still won't lay flat here. And part of it was because I have a narrower head. I know you think I have a big head, but I have a narrower head. And the way this was designed was for a specific kind of head type. Turns out, Caucasian man. So we went on a big, the original, not the one any of you have tried probably. We went on this big research thing where we measured heads of everyone we could find with like measuring tape. We measured heads to really understand not just like the circumference of a head, but the dimensions this way, like lengthwise and widthwise. I, as a fashion designer, deal with this all the time, so this was not that new of a concept. But for a hardware product, it was one of the first ones that I've ever worked on where I've measured people's heads for a living for Microsoft. Then is, of course, race. You've heard all about the AI nightmares with people not training their AI models with people of different skin colors and they're not recognized on Zoom or wherever. In Team Holo, one thing that we kept in mind from the beginning was when you raise your hand, the camera here has to detect your finger in the air. And it has to detect all colors. And ironically, one of the colors it wasn't detecting was like very, very pale. I had a colleague that was very pale, Irish background, very pale skin, very blue veins. So it wasn't detecting against a specific background. So it wasn't picking up her hand. And we realized like, oh, okay, so this is also race. When we think of race, we think of, people with darker skin, but race is also people with light skin. So keep that in mind if you're building products that have any sort of like visual recognition. Age range. We talk about age range in terms of kid stuff, right? We're like, do you need child safety stuff like 12 and under, 12 to 18? Is this over 18? But we don't talk about end of life. In this picture here is of my friend Bamasan. He's in Nigeria working on a program where he helps older people regain employment. So people who might have been let go of their jobs, but there's also a lot of jobs to be done. So how can he match older people who aren't in college, who might not have the right networks to be able to get placed into these jobs? It's an awesome organization. I feel like this should exist in every country with the right cultural context. I feel like it should be run by people from the country and not by, US people, because we don't actually understand what kinds of jobs need to be done and what are like the physical exertion things needed. So I'll tell you end of life. This comes up all the time on social media. Like someone's father passes away. What happens to his social media accounts? Someone is logged into their Windows PC and they, have an Azure subscription. And how can someone get access to that and cancel it? We don't think about, next of kin when we build software. We just don't. And I feel like we're getting to that point where we need to start thinking about it. I know talks by Donna, so enthusiastic, so, uplifting, sorry, but end of life is a thing that we need to think about. You'll realize that we live I mean, I realized recently we're living to be 117 years old. It's a long life, but how are we factoring that into some of the work we do? Are we factoring in that people actually use our technology over the age of 60? And when they no longer use our technology, how does end of life factor? And then, of course, economic condition and tech literacy. So on the left is a picture of our favorite Power Apps hero, Samit Saini, of course, coming from non-tech expert background to becoming a tech expert. How did he figure out how to build Power Apps from Excel? Because I don't think it's that straightforward to discover unless you have some amount of tech literacy. And I asked him this question many times. I'm like, so you've never taken coding? No. And you are dyslexic? Yes. And you were never good at math? No. You found this documentation. Interesting, right? So I think a lot about in terms of documentation, but also discoverability. How does the person even know, who comes from maybe not super tech literate background, that this thing even exists? And if they know, what is their economic condition like? In the middle is a post from my friend Caleb Nadaka. He's in Kenya, and his business is called Kids Comp Camp, where kids code camp. He goes from village to village teaching educators and children how to use basic computing. So they learn typing, then they learn coding via code.org tutorials and make code tutorials. And he noticed something really interesting, which is because teachers' tech literacy was lower, they didn't want to use computers in front of kids, so the tech literacy of the village stayed low. There's a problem, right? Talk about keeping just the average tech literacy down, because there's gatekeepers who are keeping it down. So that's the thing to figure out. How are you building your offering for people who may not have tech literacy the way you're used to, but people who can figure it out? And then there's, of course, economic condition, like who is your offering going to? I want to show you something about economic condition. And I saw this in some article a long time ago, and I cannot remember where I saw it, so I had to recreate it with these amazing 3D visualizations from PowerPoint. When we categorize the world into economic condition, you think about where your offering lies. Does it lie with somebody who, if their main mode of transportation, meaning the main thing they can afford, not what they choose, but what they can afford, is a pair of shoes? Or is the main thing they can afford a bicycle? Or can they afford a car? So when you think about your offer in these ways, you figure out, like, if your offering cannot be used by people who can only ever afford a pair of shoes, then what are you doing with this offer? Are you making a different offer? Are you going to exclude this audience? Like, what's the strategy and what's the plan? So this is how I think about economic breakdown. And I come back to this graphic over and over again. I know there's a million other ways to do this, but when I think about it per country, this makes sense to me. Because looking at it by currency and all this doesn't make as much sense to me, since there are countries where you may be middle class, maybe, lower economic background, but you can afford more things. And in the US, we've got extremely super rich billionaires, and then people who live way below the poverty line. I grew up below the poverty line. So I'm fully aware. I grew up with being able to only afford shoes, and now I can afford a car. So that trajectory has changed. And some of the things I'm able to afford now, I didn't even know existed when I was growing up. So I'm sure that's true for many of you. Now, this is not a comprehensive checklist. Okay, so if any of you are screenshotting this, don't be like, okay, I checked these boxes, so I'm done. These are just some things that fit on a slide, first of all, and some things that I've thought through recently. So if you are thinking about people with disabilities, we've gone through all these: blind, deaf, mobility, height. Height is interesting. One of our colleagues, Rory, he is under 4 feet tall. So many of the things we put into place, like around the office, Peloton, they don't work for him. So, height is a factor for people with disabilities. So keep that in mind. That was a new one for me. Power connectivity. So let's talk through some of these. Is your offer for somebody who is always connected via internet, always connected via electricity, slow or droppy internet? This is every airplane you've ever been on where the internet kind of sucks. Occasionally connected. to the internet, occasionally connected to electricity. These are our South Africa friends. And then never internet and never electricity. They're not really, they don't always go together, which was interesting to me. Like when I spent time in Nigeria, I would have connectivity on my phone. We just wouldn't have electricity. So it was always internet, occasionally electricity. So they don't always go together, often go together, but figure it out for your offering. Country, language, culture, we've talked about this. The country they live in, the country they're from, the region in the country, that matters too. Their primary language, secondary language, and then any cultural traditions or taboos. Okay, let's talk about race, gender. This is probably the one with the longest list because we as humans are always evolving and changing. Recently, we were doing some work with Black communities in the US, Hispanic communities in the US, Latino communities, Caucasian, etc. Gender neutral. This came up for my fashion line, which I'll tell you about. Someone reached out and said, hey, I am gender neutral. I would love for you to design something for me out of your gorgeous textiles. I'm like, okay, what do you want to make? So now we're in ideation phase. You know, male, female, trans female, undefined. There's a long list. It really depends on country. So look at the country you're in or country you're building for, and then let that define the race and gender. And then there's age, under 12, 12 to 18, 18 to 70, 70 plus, and end of life. So economic and tech literacy can and is willing to afford X many dollars / whatever your local currency is. There's people who can afford and people who are willing to afford. There's certain cultures where families actually cannot afford technology, but they will sacrifice other things to buy technology so their children can have a better life. I've seen that many times, especially when I was in Nigeria, Ghana, Nepal, where I'm from. My family's from Nepal. We had a computer, though we didn't always have the best other conditions, right? That was really, really interesting. People who don't have a credit card. I think we in the US forget this. Like, oh, just put in your credit card to get this offer. What if people don't have that? What about other payment mechanism? Many times people do bank transfer, bank to bank transfer. That's their main method of exchanging currency. But most Western companies don't think about that. This is why cryptocurrency, I think, is having quite the moment right now. In terms of tech literacy, are they the kind of person who takes recommendations for others? Do they discover stuff on their own? Or are they an early adopter? Just some things to think about. So as you go about this, as I go about this, I ask myself 3 questions, okay? 1, who am I intentionally excluding? Okay. As you build your product or offering, there are going to be people who you intentionally exclude, and that is okay. It might be, hey, I'm not factoring in people who live in this country, or I'm not factoring in people who make this kind of income. That is okay, but you just need to know that, because the more you document it, the more you can focus on who you are intentionally including and make sure you're doubling down on them. The more important question is actually, who are you unintentionally excluding? So this happens all the time. Here in this image, you're seeing a picture of my colleague, Ann Taylor, who is blind, showing Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, how to use Seeing AI, which is an app that looks at the world around you using Azure Cognitive Services. So she would look at something and it would say, you know, man standing with black polo shirt 2 feet away. Now, many people build technology not realizing that they're unintentionally excluding, say, people with disabilities or people of a certain height or a certain race or a certain gender. This happens with tech all the time, only because we don't think through it. That's not why. It's not like we set out and say, I shall exclude people who are blind from my offering. That's not what we do. We just forget. We don't think about it because we get wrapped up in, okay, here's an idea, let's ship it, let's get into the hands of people. But once you realize this, the best thing you can do is pull them into your, testing process, your insider process, and see how your offering is even working for them. Which brings us to our last question, which is, how do you shift left 1 step in your offering? Okay, so what does this mean? What is this chart? There are 6 phases here. Research. Should this thing even exist? How are people solving it today? What is the problem I'm trying to solve? Okay, next, ideation. What are some ideas I have to solve this problem that people are having today? That is better than their current solution. Okay, ideation. Third, design. Let's draw flowcharts, right? People come here, do this, do that. People come here, do this, do that. Development, let's write code, right? Write code, put stuff together, et cetera, et cetera. Testing, put this in the hands of somebody. And deployment, put this into the hands of lots of people. So how can you shift one step left? Say you just realized, I don't think I know how hard of hearing people could use my app service thing. Add that to deployment, right? Make sure that gets into the hands of some people. If it's already being deployed, think about how to pull it into testing. You're going to see my amazing animation skills right now. So for example, if you're in deployment, figure out how to move it to testing. The mistake people make is trying to now pull all of those factors, those 6 factors I told you, into research. You will get overwhelmed and your product will not ship if you try to think about everyone all the time at every phase. It's much better to figure out where you're at and shift left by one step. So I'll show you an example from my own fashion line. I feel much more comfortable using my own fashion line examples because, hey, it's our company and I get to decide how we are going to be the most inclusive fashion line in the world. I've said we're going to be the most inclusive fashion line in the world, and across those 6 elements, that is true. So what does that mean on that spectrum, right? Inclusion is a spectrum. It's not like you're inclusive, not inclusive. How are you inclusive? So let's just talk through some of the things that I'm working through right now. This is a real table that I'm using. People with disabilities. I'm working with someone who has a leg amputation, my friend Marley, on making a pair of pants. Okay, this is at the ideation phase. We haven't designed the pants, we haven't deployed it to anyone, but we researched on like, how do people with amputations buy clothes? Did a bunch of research, zip off things, this and that. I'm like, zip off things, no. So now I'm ideating a pair of pants. Power connectivity. How do people who don't have internet discover my brand? They might not actually. It might be through a pop-up in a place, right? Say we have a pop-up in South Africa. Say we go and set up in, I don't know, some marketplace in Johannesburg or Durban. How would our point of sale system, which we use Shopify for, how would that work? Would we have enough electricity to do it? Or would this be like a cash transaction? So these are just things to think about. Country, language, culture. A big focus area for me is modest fashion. I realize people who prefer to dress more modestly don't have as many options that are, attractive. So I don't want people who want modest things that maybe cover, their wrists or here to only have to wear gray. So I'm working on a whole line of like modest friendly fashion for, the Middle East, but also many cultures in the US who prefer to wear more modest clothing. The race, gender, I told you. So I'll tell you in terms of where I'm at in the phase. I'm at ideation with the people with disabilities for the power connectivity. This will have to be a deployment. We haven't deployed it yet, but when we go to deploy, next time I'm in South Africa, you're sure as heck believe I'm going to do a pop-up. So I'm at the research phase on modest fashion. Like, what does that mean? Is it wrists? Is it up to here? Is it to the ankles? Like, what are some brands that are doing it? Why aren't these brands being, why aren't these in the mainstream, etc. Race, gender, I'm at the ideation phase. So I'm working with my gender neutral friend to write down some of the things. We're like, okay, what about a cool tunic in an interesting color? How about like a big oversized shirt that can be, belted or not belted? So just in the ideation phase. Age, end of life, gotten a bunch of feedback from younger people saying like, yo, I want to show off my arms. Like, okay, I'm always freezing, but let's think through that. And then economic power and tech literacy. A lot of people say, your offering is not possible for many of us. I'm like, okay, what are some lower cost things I can do? Like, can it be a cool bag? Can it be, an interesting top or something like that, where we still pay our tailors a lot of money, but more people are able to afford it. So this is how I think through this and how can I shift left as much as possible. I think once you're at research and ideation, you're in a good place, but I'm always looking for more ways to shift left. So Let's do 3 case studies that are more technically relevant. And I have not thought through this in copious detail, so if you have ideas, please tell me. Case study 1. I am a dev or citizen dev. I'm building an expense tracker app. This is a real thing that's happening in Microsoft right now. We're building an expense tracker app. People with disabilities. Does this work with a screen reader? B1, you're better. So that is a question. How do we make sure of that? Let's go to the ideation phase. Should it work with a screen reader? Yes. The development phase. How do you make sure of that? Here's the steps. Connectivity. How does this work offline? Many times I'm putting expenses in, it's on an airplane, so it better work offline. Country language. Will it be available for download in Russia? We have an office. Race, gender, I haven't thought through this. Age, end of life. Is this over 18 or is this okay for people under 18? We have high school interns sometimes who are under 18. So is it cool for them to use it? I feel like yes. Let's think through it. And then economic power, tech literacy. Maybe for people who aren't the most tech savvy, they may not know how to use all of like the cool Power BI visualizations. Where should we put that documentation so they find it? Next, IT admin, deploying a vacation tracker site. If any of you have deployed a vacation tracker, thoughts and prayers, because there's an adventure. Okay, first, the first version of this didn't work for people on my team because they're not using a mouse. So doing the little slidey thing on your vacation does not work. How can you figure out a way to do this hands-free for limited mobility users? Connectivity, see previous statement, right? This better work offline because if I'm on an airplane going to vacation, I want this to work. Okay, country language turned out to be the big question. Do we repopulate with the vacation days in each country this deploys to? Are we up to date with which vacation days we do in each country? Like bank holidays in the UK, completely different than holidays in the US, completely different than holidays in Brazil. So how do we pre-populate per region, keeping up with, oh, this is now a vacation day, not a vacation day. How often do we update that data store? Race, gender, haven't thought through it. Age, end of life, again, what if interns are under 18? And again, back to the documentation. Where do you put the documentation? These are kind of, enterprisey specific things, but you get my point. And then the third one, and I think this is probably the most interesting one in terms of human psychology. There's a project leader who is rolling out a mental health program for their organization. Okay. What about people who have a diagnosed mental illness? Like you're diagnosed with bipolar disorder or depression. What does this mental health program mean to you? Should we say it the big letters like, hey, if you have a mental health diagnosis, ignore, delete, or view it, but don't do this because it might conflict with the advice from your therapist? What do you do about that? Okay, connectivity, haven't thought through it. Country language. Mental health is such a taboo topic in much of Asia. When I have this conversation about mental health to Asian audiences, they're like, Donna, we do not talk about that here. It is seen as shame on our family to even talk about mental health because this is something you solve. You're saying my mental health is bad because of my family. Like, whoa, did not mean that. So how do we talk about it? What is the verbiage we use? Instead of mental health, can we say productivity? Boost productivity instead of improve mental health. Can we say that? Will people get it, or does that sound like workaholicism? So just thinking through some of this. Race, gender. I'm sorry, my dudes, but men's mental health is a big topic because y'all don't talk about it. You don't talk about it. So do we cover it specially? Do we cover it as part of the thing? Do we do specific men's mental health topics? Age, end of life. Over 18 only, please. This will require parents. Checkbox. And then economic power and tech literacy. Are we assuming enough people have the ability to find therapy, right? Like funds to find therapists. Therapists are expensive. What free options are there and how can we make sure to offer those? So it's a lot of information. And because it's me and you're in one of my talks, there's of course homework. So here's what I would love for you to do, okay? First in this picture is a bunch of power addicts in Prague. I miss you all so much. So 4 pieces of homework for you. Think through your offering, whatever that is, whatever you're going to build, whatever you're building now. Who are you intentionally excluding on purpose? And it's okay that you are. Who are you unintentionally excluding? How can you move your inclusion thinking up one phase, shift left one phase? And I would really love to hear from you. I would love to hear if this is valuable. I would love to hear if you want more things like this. And I would really love to hear some of the considerations you're making as you build products, because as you all build better products, we can learn from each other, and I too can help build better products. Thank you so much for joining me.